Good afternoon. Welcome everybody who's here today, and also the folks watching us live streaming on the internet. I'm Ben Brook-Markle. I'm Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society. We have an exciting program for you here today. John Foster, who is the co-editor of the Florida Historical Society Press book, Calling Yankees to Florida, Harriet, Beecher, Stowe's Forgotten Tourist Articles, will be talking with us in just a moment. But first, I know we have a lot of old friends here, but we have some new folks too, who I want to make sure you know where you are. This is the statewide headquarters of the Florida Historical Society. It's also our Library of Florida History, where we have our archive. We maintain our archive of thousands of rare and out-of-print books, maps dating back to the 1500s, photographs, postcards, all sorts of great genealogical information, great research materials here. We also manage the historic Rossiter House Museum down in Nogales. We operate the Florida Historical Society Press, which publishes great books like Calling Yankees to Florida. We have all sorts of educational outreach throughout the state, including Florida Frontiers, the weekly radio magazine of the Florida Historical Society, which can be heard on public radio stations all over the state. Here locally, you can hear it on 90.7 WMFE, Thursday evenings at 6:30 and Sunday afternoons at 4. Also on WFIT, Sunday mornings at 7 on 89.5 WFIT. And all around the state on different times on different stations. So we do all sorts of public outreach. In fact, our educational resources coordinator is at another event today with a booth of FHS materials. But we're really happy to have you here. Although we're the statewide historical society, we are not supported by the state. We don't get funds from the state. We're an independent 501c3. So we depend on membership. And I know a lot of you here are members. But for those who aren't, we'd love to encourage you to become a member today. If you become a member of the Florida Historical Society, you'll get this wonderful tote bag right here, as well as a complimentary copy of the classic History of Florida by Stowe and Marina, which is pretty much pays for your membership right there. Also, as a member of the Florida Historical Society, you will get 4 times a year our outstanding journal, the Florida Historical Quarterly, which has all sorts of interesting articles about all different aspects of Florida history. You'll also get our newsletter, the Society Report, which will keep you up to date on all of the great projects and programs that we have going as part of the Florida Historical Society. You'll be the first to find out about things like our great theatrical presentation, Ponce de Leon Landed Here, that we put on right at the beginning of the year to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the naming of our state. You can watch that online as well, and events like this as well. So we encourage you to become a member of the Florida Historical Society. As I say, you'll get all of that today. I wanted to make sure that you are aware, too, that we have all of our Florida Historical Society Press books, and if you become a member, you get a 10% discount on anything in our bookstore. So we hope you'll become a member today. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for today, John Foster, John T. Foster Jr., taught anthropology at Florida A&M University for 40 years, right?
40 years.
And his wife, Sarah Whitmer Foster, was also a professor of sociology and anthropology at the same university. And they co-edited this book together, Calling Yankees to Florida, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Forgotten Tourist Articles, which is published by the Florida Historical Society Press. He has published other books and edited other books as well about, that deal heavily with Harriet Beecher Stowe and other Florida topics. In fact, today he'll tell you more about it, but in addition to offering his book today, Contentment and the Pursuit of Ambition, The Grattans and Their Remarkable Women, is another book that we'll be offering at half price today, just because you're here. It's a $20 book. We'll be selling it for $10 today, and he'll be telling you more about that. But we were so pleased, the Florida Historical Society Press, to publish Calling Yankees to Florida. It's a fascinating book, wonderful vignettes, as John will tell you, of Florida as it was in the 19th century. And but Harriet Beecher Stowe also had kind of a hidden agenda for writing these wonderful tourist articles as well, as John will tell you. But without further ado, John Foster.
Appreciate it. to, in other words, give you a summary of different topics. And then I'll go to each of them at a little bit greater length. Number one is, why was Harriet Beecher Stowe important? I think many of you know, but we'll cover some of that. Why did she choose Florida? And there are obvious reasons, and then there are some that are not very obvious. And of course her own agenda, what it really was. The agenda has been talked about in yet an earlier book my wife and I did with the University Press of Florida in the late 90s, and it was featured even on the front page of the Miami Herald. It's nice to be on the front page of a newspaper, and I haven't shot anybody, I haven't stolen anything, and so there you go. I want to deal with the research that we've done. It's been spread out almost over 30 years. It includes 6 journal articles. It's one thing to build a house, and it's another to cook your own bricks to do it. And so that's sort of the theme of what we've been doing. A different question is, why don't more people know about Stowe and her life in Florida, and particularly its impact on tourism. By the way, this is all pre-Flagler stuff. Okay. Then I want to talk a bit about how this new book is better than Stowe's own book about Florida, which is Palmetto Leaves. Okay. And in fact, in our earlier book, we suggested that Stowe actually intended to do another book about Florida, and never did. And so in some ways, this is the book that Stowe could have created, at least in terms of the articles that are published or reprinted here. By the way, with them, we tried to do them exactly as they originally appeared, which can be a bit of a challenge when you're looking at some of the kinds of copies that exist. And so these are flat what she had to say. And I want to talk a little bit about our other book. But all of this is part of research that's ongoing, still being done, and I've submitted an article to the Quarterly about Stowe, and when did she first think of Florida, and what was the context of it. So there you go. That's an overview. Harriet Beecher Stowe is important. I'm sure many of you are aware of what supposedly Abraham Lincoln said to her on her visit to the White House, that you're this little woman who started this great war. There was a series on PBS just a few weeks ago about abolition, and how the abolitionists had tried and tried and tried to build a fire under the cause. And Uncle Tom's Cabin seemingly built an unlimited fire under the cause. And so you have people like the political editor of Harper's Weekly said that Uncle Tom's Cabin would, quote, always be famous, not only as the most vivid picture of an extinct evil system, but as one of the most powerful influences in overthrowing it. There are people who write books, and then there are a few books that people suggest that changed history. Well, here are some things that go with Uncle Tom's Cabin that begin to suggest how fast this thing took off. It was published as a book. First of all, it was a serial, but as a book on March 20, 1852. It sold 10,000 copies in the first week. 300,000 copies in the United States in the first year. 1.5 million copies in the same period in Great Britain. So in fact, it is 5 times more popular in Great Britain than it is in the United States. It produced $10,000 income for Stowe in the first 3 months of sales. I have seen things of the 19th century where $1,000 a year was a pretty handsome income for an attorney in a year. Imagine $10,000 in the first 3 months. And this is a quote that goes with that. This was the largest sum of money by any author, either American or European, from the sale of a single work in so short a time. And I found something else. It is said to be the most popular 19th century novel published. But when you start thinking about Dickens, Austen, and so forth, and this is, I'd hate to prove that though. But here's something that Debbie Applegate wrote in her Pulitzer Prize-winning biography about Stowe's brother, Henry Ward Beecher. She noted that Beecher's fame did not match his sister's. Quote, "She was the most famous woman in the English-speaking world." Wasn't Queen Victoria there too? Again, I'm glad somebody says that. Debbie Applegate does. Most famous woman in the English-speaking world. So that puts her on the map. And here she is. She started coming to Florida in 1867, rapidly brought an orange grove in Mandarin, which is when you cross the Buckman Bridge. You know, you're bypassing Jacksonville, avoiding downtown, and so you come across the St. Johns River on 295 on the 6 or 8 lane Buckman Bridge. And if you look off to the south as you come down on the east side of the river, you are looking at Mandarin and where her house would have been, very close to it. So here the lady is. And she continued coming to Florida for 17 years. In the book you will buy, I hope you will, it says she writes 52 letters and articles about Florida that were published. 52. She took 17 of them from one year, 1872, and made a book out of it called Palmetto Leaves. Still in print. Probably copies in there. And so she was here. But why did she come? Well, if you pick up any biography, you would realize she hated winters, and particularly blizzards in March, just when you think you're going to see spring, and you end up with 2 feet of snow. She was horrified by the whole thing. She has a son who is an alcoholic, and his experiences in the Civil War did not help that. So she needed a place to hide his son, maybe for him to recover. But there are other reasons for her coming to Florida, too. There's a list of relatives in the biographies that you could find, and then there are people, relatives, who are not in the biographies. Okay? And what's interesting is a lot of the men made it, and for some reason the women didn't. All right? Relatives, family members. Okay? The most obvious family member who made it was her half-brother, James. He had a black infantry unit in Jacksonville and had fought at the Battle of the Lustig. He was not there. He was off trying to get repeating rifles for his men, so he wasn't with them at Lustig. But he showed up there soon afterwards, got his girlfriend to come down, Frances Perkins, and they were married in Jacksonville, a military service, 1864, summer. So this is what the biographers will tell you. James is in Florida, Frances Perkins. Beecher's in Florida, so she has relatives here in the Civil War. And he had other relatives here in the Civil War, too. Try 2 first cousins. This is Harriet Ward Foote Hawley, first cousin. Now, in the Civil War, if you're the wife of an officer and he's husband did garrison duty first for most of 1863. First of all in Fernandina, which is up in the corner of Florida by Jacksonville, and then in St. Augustine. And so she comes down and joins her husband. Since her health wasn't the best, she brings her little sister Katie. Now these aren't typical women of the 19th century. No, you're looking at an abolitionist here, a woman who believes in doing her own thing. She wanted to, in fact, be involved in nursing, and she ultimately does. But while she's on garrison duty, she writes articles for a newspaper, and they're published. Did you hear that? A woman writing articles for a newspaper and had them published in the Civil War, no less. Half were about Sea Islands, there were 4 of those, and there were 4 from Florida. So here's a woman in her 30s charting her own path. By the way, all these people end up in Hartford, and so if Stowe wanted questions about Florida, just have coffee and talk to your cousin. All right. Oh, it goes on, and I have written some with my wife. Here's the half-sister. Here's Isabella Beecher Hooker. Now she can talk to half-sister. Right there in Hartford. Have any questions about Florida? She wasn't here very long, though. She came in the aftermath of the Battle of Lusty and then wanted to know what really happened. So she talks to the officers like a 20th century woman, wanting to know what really went on, including the horror and the awful situation of black soldiers who were wounded, who were killed on the battlefield afterwards. All right? Sounds like something the Nazis could have done. So I don't care to ever go to a reenactment of Lusty, if you really know what it meant to have been there. But she wanted to know. She wrote her husband about it. Well, so here are reasons. Cold weather, wants to get out of there, hide a son. Ooh, but she's got all these family folks right there to fill you in on Florida. What you won't see, our book talks about the Civil War plan of Yankees to seize Florida. But there was also a plan to do it after the war. And that's needs to be in there at some point. It was written by Edward Everett Hale. And Hale proposed in 1864 for Yankees to seize this place. And he points out this would be the easiest southern state to take over. It wouldn't take many folks at all. And he published it in the Atlantic Monthly. Same Atlantic Monthly still exists. But what people, even in the history books, didn't realize, though, way back yonder in the quarterly, the Atlantic Monthly was started by Harriet Beecher Stowe and her friends. She published in it often, including serialized books, 4 or 5 of them. So when Edward Everett Hale published his thing, guess what? That's the last article in that issue. First one is a piece of one of Stowe's serialized books. By the way, Hale was married to her niece, and she used to send me notes saying, "Your loving aunt." So she knew of these plans to seize Florida years before she ever came. And she would have known it as soon as the Atlantic Monthly was delivered to her mailbox. Well, our knowledge of the secret agenda comes in a completely different way. That's current knowledge. I'm still working on this. And this last fall found 5 more articles that she wrote, published about Florida. I've got a little handout coming around on that. So when you see we say 52, it's 57 published letters and articles. We didn't begin with this. We began with a diary written by a Methodist minister. We had a multiracial ministry in Jacksonville. That's how it begins. And he's doing this, would you believe, 1865? Come on down. All right? The amazing things here with winter vegetables. And at one point he talks about a basket of cucumbers he had shipped to New York and got $5 for the basket. We're talking about big time money for one little basket of cucumbers. And then he talks about the citrus and orange trees and mandarin. So he's trying to get people to come on down. Then finally, towards the end of his series, he flat says it. We're going to sell these people out. We're going to take this place over. We're going to do Kansas and Nebraska over this place. Now, she never says that. After all, some Klansman would have taken notes and probably reached for a gun. But John Swain's an older man, an abolitionist, and what sets him off on the cause of everything is that you may not know it, but a bunch of the Andersonville people ended up in Jacksonville. And some of them in such poor, abysmal health. Guess who got to bury them? Methodist minister helped bury them. So he took a lot of this personal. And one of the few articles that isn't about come on down is about the Andersonville prisoners and knowing some of the families of these men. So, here's the thing. Florida has virtually no population. Try the population of Leon County 20 years ago. Roughly 180,000 people. It's almost half black and half white. But the white population, its origins are quite different from each other. The oldest segment of the population, Europeans, the background would have been the Menorcans, which should conjure up seafood industry in St. Augustine, Florida. Okay. The next group of people that arrive, and all these groups arrive differently. They're coming to Florida in a different way. These folks came by ship from Europe. Different way, of course, another group are the crackers. Think of Marjorie Kennan Rawlings and the Yearling. Think of Lawton Childs. Who took out on Lawton Childs. You can take a look at that. So, in other words, these are people who are country folks that drift in from Georgia primarily, some from Alabama. They are farmers, they're into cattle and livestock and living in pine barrens and, basic Europeans from Georgia in the old days. Country people. Lastly, in Stowe's day would have been planter Florida. This is Old South Florida. And the counties that lent themselves to that were the 5 counties in what was called Middle Florida then. And of course, that is in fact the counties right around Tallahassee. Leon County's in the middle of planter Florida. You've got Quincy and Mariana and actually Gadsden County and Jackson County to the west, and Jackson, and Monticello and Madison to the east. So you need to be thinking of those counties where you have a replication of the Old South and all it means. Where was modern Florida? I'm talking about the land of tourists and retirees, and people into novel crops in the winter, and citrus and other things. Didn't exist, but John Swain clearly has it in his sights. And so from there we started looking at his friends. So one of the most prominent and frequent people in John Swain's diary is Harrison Reed. You're now looking at the man who would be elected the state's first Republican governor. Reed was a conservative Republican, and he had one very tough And then she sees a real need for, with children, for an orphanage, so she sets one up, raises the money for it, runs it herself. There are all kinds of very wonderful descriptions of how well it went. Later, after the war, the orphanage closes, and she goes off to do this in North Carolina. And then Harrison Reed tracks her down and proposes to her. You're looking at Florida's abolitionist first lady. And so we did an article on her. And then we did an article on the Teachers Aid Society she was with, which in Florida was led by her brother-in-law. So here you have this group of people, and once she is first lady, then things start really changing in the Reed administration. Because a historian wrote in the 1950s that her husband was preoccupied with political things, so she charts the social legislation of her husband's administration. The current school system that we have comes from the Reeds in that period. Now, she, of course, needs to have a man who will listen to her and do a great job and get this school system up and running. So the next person who arrives on the scene is Charles Beecher. This is a state superintendent of public instruction. Harriet Beecher Stowe, one of her two favorite brothers, a member of the Florida cabinet. Does a great job. Leaves all kinds of recommendations that educators cited for decades. At the top of the list is, you could go, he said, into a classroom and five textbooks among all these kids, and they're all different and they're all outdated. He proposed, let's have some real textbooks, let's have the state buy them and loan them to the kids. Sounds a pretty good idea, doesn't it? Try 1870s idea. He also said that having a whole bunch of colleges doesn't make them good. In fact, to have a whole bunch of schools and call it a college doesn't really make it a college. Stay on. Where is this all leading? Well, Harrison Reed, after he's governor, sets up a magazine to encourage the development of Florida. And so guess who writes articles? Two of them for it. Charles does, and Harriet Beecher Stowe does. So this woman is what? The famous novelist is beginning to, you can document directly interacting with the Reeds. And one of those articles is very important because it, in fact, is trying to get protection for birds in Florida. And the book, The Swamp, that looks at the environment through time, declares that that paper is the first environmental broadside ever published in Florida. Stowe did it. Do her biographers know that? No. The other article is an elaborate account of Mrs. Alexander Mitchell's estate, and that's Harrison Reed's sister's house. So she is interacting with these people. So one way to look at it is, what's the purpose of the 50-some articles? It is, in fact, to encourage the growth of modern Florida, to open the door for new opportunities. By the way, John Swain endorsed the idea of black public officials, was complimentary of them. He started Cookman Institute, which exists for 50 years before it was merged within Cookman College, just right up the road. Okay. So there's a real involvement in trying to make a place of opportunity for all Americans right here in the South. And so that's what the introduction of the book is about. Then the book then is her articles, flat her articles, okay? Some of them, I think, are once-over on the contents of the book, and then, okay, open things up for questions in a little bit. So here is a once-over on some of the contents of the book. By the way, tourism does change, and local people in Jacksonville talk about the building of hotels in the 1870s. The historian there, T. Frederick Davis, does. They built 4 hotels in the mid-70s. But if you look it up, that was during one of the greatest depressions in the United States history. It began in 73, but tourism takes off. In 72, they talk about 12,000 tourists. In 74, they're talking about 40,000 tourists. Because after all, you're getting the most famous woman in the world talking about Florida, both in newspaper articles and in a book. And then people come, except it's during a depression they come. So one way of looking at Stowe is she changes history twice. One is she changes it by hoping to really start the Civil War. And then she turns around and changes tourism in Florida. By the way, Henry Flagler wasn't even on the scene. Now, he moves people to new places, to new resorts, and he builds lavish hotels. He's not the Daniel Boone of tourism. He didn't take the 2 sticks and rub them together, and voila, we have tourists. The tourists are already here. They're just in Jacksonville and St. Augustine. They're not going on down the state into new places. Well, real fast, the contents of the book, because I really think it's a better book. But we're up against articles spread out, okay, I think over 11 years in the book, maybe longer, 14. In any case, we have them from 67 to the early 80s. Okay. She's got in her book articles from 1 year. She goes to different places in this longer period of time, and one of the most wonderful experiences is doing Silver Springs. I'm talking about before anybody had messed it up. And then she sees it by torchlight. So that's chapter 1. So we're going to take her to what really turned her on. I think it's the best article she ever wrote about Florida. Number 2 in this is that she wrote Palmetto League. She came down by rail from Savannah. It took like 10 hours. It's 100 miles. 10 hours by rail. You know, how much slower could it get? Well, I guess you could be on Carnival Triumph and be towed by a towboat. But by the mid-70s, you can make the whole trip by rail. So she does it once. So in this article, she's talking about what it was like to do it by rail all the way down, and then to what it's like to do it by steamship and steamboat. That's her normal path. Chapter 3 is if Harriet Beecher Stowe were alive today, there'd be no doubt what she would be. She'd be a minister. She says this raft of brothers, all of whom had to become ministers because her father was a famous minister, and her brother was a famous minister. The other guys that could care less about the ministry. She cared. And so the third article is about trying to recruit someone to be a missionary in the Mandarin area in the 1870s. So in fact, she writes a sermon. Number 4 is she was so famous, guess what a newspaper just had to do? New York Tribune sent out a reporter as obnoxious as any reporter alive today. In other words, there's something in the blood about reporting for some folks. I mean, this guy goes over to a place, I don't know, a loan officer from a bank would have been any more thorough, okay, and offended her. But this gives a chance for him to describe her property and for her to describe how it changed. Number 5 is a description of Mandarin in the fall, and it also talks about crossing the St. Johns River bar, which doesn't really exist since the creation of the Jays. By chapter 6, in this long period of time, transportation changes. So she's no longer riding on an old-fashioned steamship paddled by side wheel paddles. No, she's on a brand new steamship powered like steamships today with propellers. And then she gets in this horrible storm on that ship and then describes apples taking off as the ship moves from side to side. The apples are running everywhere. She talks about coming to Planter, Florida. She got daring and went to Tallahassee. There was a whole group of people. She didn't know how she'd be greeted in Tallahassee, but she came to Tallahassee anyway. She was a gutsy person. Early descriptions of places near Mandarin, Magnolia, and Greencoat Springs, as it once would have been. There's even a thing on Florida on fire. You know what they're doing out there in these controlled burns? They were doing it in her time. And then she gets in a buggy with a marsh tacky and then goes out riding through where all these fires have been while stuff's still smoldering. Well, there are all kinds of things about one's an enchanted evening and a perfect day, playing croquet at night by torchlight. And it's interesting. I think it's colorful. And I think in many ways it's a better book for just the articles alone. Any questions at this point?
Well, you said that Uncle Tom's Cabin was serialized initially. Well, correct?
Right.
What was her status when she tried to sell that serial to the newspaper? Where was she in her career then?
This is really very early in her career. This would have been, she was born in around 1811, 12, and then you're looking at her in the early 50s. And from this point on, then she's forever, and well, not forever, but for most of her life in the writing business. There are all
Did she have
kinds
any
of
trouble getting them to publish it? Partly my question.
I think it's
Was she
more,
known?
the thing that's most vivid is trying to struggle with getting reasonable return from it. And by the way, with the return, you need to think of this being before any kind of the normal copyright laws we have now. There were estimates, there were 1,000 stage performances of Uncle Tom's Cabin, that millions of Americans were familiar with Uncle Tom's Cabin through the stage. She did not get the money and the royalties from those things. Okay. Nor did she from these overseas things either. And so you're looking at a pittance off of what a modern writer would have done. And she had some real roaring arguments with the publisher. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Other questions? Two
Did she
other
know Mark
things.
Twain?
Or-
You said Hartford, Connecticut. Did they have? I know the book doesn't pertain to Florida, but you did mention Mark Twain.
Oh, if you ever go, and I encourage everyone to do it, this is one of the things I find very mind-boggling. You have Forest Street, the Day House on the corner, which the Stowe Foundation uses. You have her house. Now, that's on Forest, and I've forgotten the name of this major road in front. The next house to the Days is the house that Clements bought, built for his wife. So, in fact, you have two of the most famous authors in all of 19th century America at ground zero with property that, in fact, adjoins each other. And so, now he's a generation younger, obviously, and the age of some of Stowe's children. But I don't know, when you go to Hartford, West Hartford, you need to think not only Stowe, but Clements, and then do both for the same money, because you're there. And this is where Clements writes his most famous things. Here is a thing related to the discovery of more Stowe articles and how that was done in conjunction with the Stowe Center. There are her very first publication of Florida are now in hand. This talks about how it was done. And then on the back, the reason a lot of people wanted her articles, may not have quite enough to go around, but let's just see how far they go. This talks about the discovery. And then on the back I have what a lot of people were really wanting, and that is that on her first trip she met a woman, an African-American woman, who had served as a spy in Jefferson Davis's White House. And she interacts with this person. There was an article in the New York Times last year about her. And so what you have over here on the backside is the excerpts that deal with this woman. Sadly, she doesn't say all or very much about what the woman had actually done as a spy. That would have been beyond fantastic. But it also ends with a bit of humor, and so this gives you a piece of her very first article ever written about Florida, period. And you are the first folks, other than you can count on one hand, who've ever seen it. Because we discovered the newspapers where it was, and they had not been findable for eons. So there you have a piece of Harriet Beecher Stowe that with all these millions of people in Florida who've never seen it. Okay? So, there you go. Other questions?
What was her reception in Tallahassee? She was going from more of a northern enclave to a southern enclave, I understand. And how did that move?
Well,
Shot there.
if you, they get along okay. Keep in mind, this is the place most affected by Uncle Tom's Cabin. These are people who lost vast amounts of their wealth because of the Civil War. But she's also world famous, so guess what? They were hospitable. Then the war was over. And that's about, I want to say about 74. In the, there is a photograph of her at Tallahassee on the steps of the Capitol building. And I think I've got one in this earlier book. But no, it went okay. She went with a large group. She went with a delegation. She did come to some social events. And I was going to pass it over for you to look at. But maybe it didn't make this one.
It's in College Yankee.
It's in College Yankee, so it's there. And she's actually meeting the last Republican governor of Florida in the 19th century. So he's on the steps. That's Marcellus Stearns, who fought for the Union and is missing an arm, if you saw Stearns up close. No, and then she went on, but she was with a group of people. She didn't do this singularly. Probably she got along very well with the crackers. And she appreciated their hospitality. And then the end of her last one was new from 68. She spends a night in a cracker home. She went to Mandarin to St. Augustine by donkey cart. And it got real slow. As you can imagine, a donkey could get slow out through the pine barrens. And so she came upon a cracker house as it's getting dark. Folks are incredibly hospitable. And that was her experience with crackers. A lot of these people could read and write, didn't know who she was, and didn't care. All right? She was a person in need. And they were gracious and hospitable. People actually she hated at times were Yankees. They'd come to the window in the house in Mandarin. By the way, there is a photo of the house in Mandarin, or lithograph. Where is it? Klutzing around. And they'd come to the windows and stare in. Can you imagine that? Come up to somebody's window, look through it, and then they'd make wise comments about, like they're at a museum, and you can say anything you want. That's what people were doing in 1869, and she denounces that. Then she talks about how Stowe were crackers, but they'd never do something that offensive. But the Yankee tourist could. But interestingly enough, in the 70s, she's still waving to people on the boats and stuff like that. She was her own tourist attraction, that famous. Okay. So that's the house, and man, don't go there looking for it. It doesn't exist. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the environmental broad side on birds, and isn't that in the book?
It's in the book.
Right, because I read it some time ago, but what I remember most is how strong a voice she had. She just takes you right in.
Yes, she really does care immensely. And if you were to go to the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography that came out in the 90s about her, Harriet Beecher Stowe life, you would find no reference to that at all, as her as an environmentalist. So in other words, it's like, I don't know, she has a very long life, because she dies in the 1890s and she's 80-some years old. But for some reason, biographers have had real difficulty coming to grips with her Florida experience and are not aware of what she did here. And the thing is that her brother projects what will happen to Florida at the centennial to the bicentennial. He talks about Miami being a place that's an enormous city when there would only been a few hundred people in Miami. And she then reacts to the environmental consequences of that. Both things are in Harrison Reed's magazine. So she's tied clearly to the governor and the first lady. But that's an important thing. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes.
Did she have a sister Catherine, and did Catherine ever visit Florida?
Catherine was a very prominent educator and set up a school for women. And Harriet went there. Catherine's much older, one of her oldest siblings, and was an educator all her life and quite a proponent of things for women. I don't know that she ever did. I was looking purely by chance at some of Joseph Hawley's stuff, and he mentioned seeing Isabella in Jacksonville. So I got on the phone and called them and said, do you have anything from Jacksonville, from Isabella? And they did. So you have a great question, and she may have. By the way, Henry Ward Beecher, his wife, came down. His wife wrote a book about Florida, and they bought a place in Florida. So there's multiple Beecher houses in Florida. So there are other family members too involved. So I find it interesting that it's more the men talked about than the women. And the women were here before a lot of the men. Other questions?
You mentioned that you're still finding work and information about Harriet Beecher Stowe. Is it unusual for somebody who was as famous as she was to not have been covered thoroughly?
I find it bizarre. If she was spending every summer 17 years in some town in Vermont, you'd be sure people would have been over that town, everything related to it, her family. Try to find an article about Charles Beecher and the Florida Historical Quarter, even though he's a member of the state cabinet. Okay? And so, yeah, I'm going along like a snail, but there's still, as I was telling Jen, I can come up with at least 2 topics like this for more things related with You think it would be exhausted, but it isn't. And of course, part of it's due to local historians that could talk about how tourism grew in Jacksonville, how hotels were built in a depression, how the town thrived, and never mentions her at all. Or the Reeds. Or Charles Beecher. In other words, it's like these people never existed because they're all Yankees, dangerous folk.
How did you happen to get drawn into this topic?
It is through John Swain's diary. I made a request of my grandmother to have a table that had always been in her house. His diary was in the table. He's not a direct relative at all. So one of the things that you can do if you really want to boggle someone into genealogy, so it's not really your biological relatives that really count. It's all the people they're related to by marriage. Whoa. Now you're opening the door for half of humankind that way. But they may be far more prominent than your own biological relatives. His diary, and then the puzzle of why is he writing things like, he's a minister writing like the Chamber of Commerce since 1865. What's he doing? And he eventually says, we went on to look at the whole newspaper for all of Reconstruction, and there are 60-some articles about Florida in that one newspaper alone. It's a Newark, New Jersey Sentinel of Freedom, which was prominent in the 19th century. So then we looked at, well, who's else in the diary, which gets us to Chloe Mary, and then we do a thing on her, and then the next question was, who's in the governor's cabinet? Oh, Charles Beecher. So in other words, rather than working from the famous lady out, we're working from their associates back to the famous. This way you can spend 3 times longer doing it. Yeah.
Harriet Beecher Stowe's husband, wasn't he a minister?
Sure.
And did he come to Florida?
Yeah, he was also a faculty member of seminaries and colleges, Calvin, Stowe. And no, he's there, and he is becoming progressively less mobile. He often sits in man room with enormous barrels of books, taking it all in. But he retired, but in the spirit of the times, there was no income coming in. So guess who supplies the income? By the way, the Atlantic Monthly in the 1860s paid Harriet Beecher Stowe $2,400 a year for 2 or 3 years. So this is the kind of sum. In other words, this is a family where the wife is the breadwinner. Sounds more modern, doesn't it?
Yeah.
By the way, one little tidbit, what I find is somewhat perplexing is that women in the past could do remarkable things and were treated in their own lifetime that way, but then drop off the planet. So if you went just to Harriet Ward Foote Hawley, you would think, well, being a journalist in the Civil War would have been an accomplishment enough, and she always wrote for the newspapers afterward. But her real passion was she wanted to be a nurse. And she ends up nursing in D.C. in 1864 in one of the worst hospitals there. And so after the war is over with, she spends decades helping veterans with pensions and things like that. So when Harriet Ward Foote Hawley died, her husband, of course, was a United States Senator. The U.S. Senate adjourned. The pallbearers in D.C. were United States senators. She goes back to Hartford, and the flag over the Capitol half-staffed on it. Her funeral is attended by men in uniform. She is given a funeral of an Army officer. Okay? For a woman that nobody today knows anything about. She had 7 children. Uh, One of the things is that she had real difficulty with children when they're young, and these were not kids in the best of health, and she finally had one who was in great health. And he ends up dying of cholera in Cleveland. And so part of the passion, this is all happening just as the 1850s are beginning, and so this is a woman who has all kinds of passion. She's very upset. She's lost the child who was healthy. And so this fuels some of the emotion that Uncle Tom's had.
And none were writers or anything.
No, in fact, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Her son Edward did put together some books about her collecting things, her writings. And he got in some kind of twit with people in Mandarin, and he tore the house down. So, the family does exist, and with our earlier book, there were people who contacted us to thank us for that she's involved in Florida other than just wintering here. And so, no, she really, I think, jump-starts tourism. Somebody like John Swain starts it, but in the article I sent into the Quarterly just this last month, I'm suggesting that they actually knew each other and that she stayed in his house because he ran a boarding house. And I know that in 1866 she sent him a letter, and I think she stayed there on his first visit. Because that makes sense. If you are world famous, why would you want to check into a hotel and write down Harriet Beecher Stowe when you want to buy property in Florida? You wouldn't do that now, would you? You've got an alcoholic son you don't want known, all right, going on. So where would be the best place to stay? In a boarding house run by abolitionists. All right, who would be forever silent. So I think she stayed right there with John Swain. And there's some reasons that also suggest that. And then I could go at some length, but I don't do that. I don't get further. I'm not often like a rabbit through a whole bunch of different things too fast and furiously. Other questions? Yes?
Question, but you alluded to the fact that the omissions of her writings and so forth. Our contemporary society still fosters that. You have people moving to Florida, and many of them haven't been here for decades, and they never have a moment vested in Florida. No thought for Florida, just a place where the weather's pretty good.
You have that at one extreme, the tens of thousands. This is often the way modern, contemporary people, but not all of them. All right.
No, not all.
Now, the opposite extreme, you take somebody like Sam Proctor, a person who writes the history of the University of Florida.
You should know better.
Well, as a Seminole, I could sympathize with your sentiments. But he also edited the Florida Historical Quarterly, 35 years, something like that. And so he's busy. But his background, his family came from Eastern Europe. And I'm not talking about generations of his father. And his father was traveling around, ran into a man who liked the name Proctor. Okay? So here's a person who grows up in Jackson. He has no deep roots here. But he invests his whole life in writing about history of Florida. And so, then you have the other things too. I was struck very deeply by the book and the movie Help. Because you see, clearly persons of color were not the right folks, other than used in some kind of subservient way. But if your background was Irish Catholic, I don't know that you would have fared a whole lot better in I once told the dean of my college, I have no idea what it's to be African American. But I do know Tallahassee way back when, because I was there in the early 60s, I know what it's to be like to be a resident alien. And so, yeah, you get all kinds of things going on.
The characters in Uncle Tom's Cabin factor, because
She spent a great deal of time documenting that this is based on facts.
it is on.
That many of the things, and she does this after the novel, she did all kinds of things to document the mistreatment of African Americans. And one of the things I think is most interesting to me is that one of the people running from the ministry was Charles Beecher. And so guess where he ran to? Where could you run more away from Christianity, of the old-fashioned hellfire and brimstone? Run to New Orleans. Now, this is what he did as a young man, all right? So when she is writing Uncle Tom's Cabin and needs info on Louisiana, she'd never been to Louisiana. Hey, this guy had as a young man. And so the idea of Simon Legree, this vicious, horrible human being, he interacted with Simon Legree. Family said that was the most realistic character in the whole book. Evil incarnate. Questions?
Was the Klan active and did she write a lot about it?
The Klan was active. I don't recall her writing about it. A person who would have been a conservative Democrat whose life went on, who became more and more upset by it, was in fact Harrison Reed. And one thing that could be said about Mrs. Reed is that she, oh, by the way, he continued to be involved in Florida after Reconstruction. And in the 80s, in the middle 80s, when most of his siblings are dying, including Stowe's husband, he decides to return to the ministry. So he has to resign from his public post. He was on the board of directors of what is now FSU, appointed by a Democratic governor. Did you hear what I said? Mrs. Reed, very active in Jacksonville with St. Luke's Hospital, and very concerned about it. And so guess what happens to her in the 1890s? She is selected as an alternate delegate to the World's Fair in Chicago. So here's one of these Yankees being publicly recognized, all right? And there is some photographs of her as an older woman. That's what it's from, the program from the World's Fair. So they stay involved. And what's interesting to me, I think, is personally, is that the great freeze that occurred, the family was stowed in when she died. So to give her the clothing appropriate for a state funeral, the Cohen's family, and if you know Jacksonville, for a long time ago, the biggest department store was Cohen's, and so the Cohen family supplied the clothing for her state funeral in honor of the kind of life she had led. So I find all these people very interesting, and I'm afraid I can talk too much. Other questions? I hope I haven't kept someone from asking a question.
How did the Civil War affect the characters in it? Was that in that period?
No, this is all before. The book was published in 1852.
Okay, but then these characters would be affected by what's going to take place.
Well, you have them escaping to the north. Some of them, Uncle Tom himself knows of two slaves who are hiding. He refuses to tell two attention and beating to death. So, of course, one of the things is that Uncle Tom's Cabin is always associated with the term Uncle Tom, but there's a real Uncle Tom hide location of runaway slaves and is beaten to death. Is that an Uncle Tom? Harriet goes on as you have all these stage plays and they make Uncle Tom something other than a middle-aged man. They make him old and subservient. And that's not quite what the real Uncle Tom was.
Well, John Foster's going to be around for a little while if you have any more questions.
Oh, by the way, if there is a different book here that's not Florida, Florida is on here in 1 or 2 pages. This is a book about a bunch of women who are strong and determined going wild in Virginia. And then in Georgia. And starting, well, this is 4 generations of a family, and the oldest daughter in the family learns German from the neighborhood kids. And then since her family has a mill and a store and a farm, they need somebody who can translate. So they put this kid, as maybe barely a teenager, in the middle of their business. She spends 70 years as a businesswoman, starting before the American Revolution. And then her father wants to arrange a marriage, and she brings the groom down to Virginia from Philadelphia. He's a man as her father's age. She rebels and runs off, publicly humiliates her father. But all her other sisters, except 1 or 2, fight with the father too over marriage, and they all win. And so when you think of Jane Austen and women marrying the man they love, well, that's, for most folks, begins in the early part of the 19th century. These women in this book are doing it, a generation earlier. And they pick men who are willing to let them do their own thing. And so one of the daughters ends up, would you believe, as First Lady of Virginia. Another ends up being the wife of an Attorney General of the United States who serves as Attorney General for 12 years under 2 different presidents. And a niece becomes First Lady of Georgia. And so this is sort of women liberated, but eons before anybody else ever dreamed of it. And they got away with it big time. Now, I've got a particular thing here. Ben, how are we going to do this?
Well, we're going to have this book it's a $20 book. We're going to have it half price for $10. And John has graciously said that the proceeds will go to the Florida Historical Society. And of course, we also have Calling Yankees to Florida, which the Florida Historical Society Press published, which is $14.95, which is John and his wife Sarah's book that we were talking about today.
But all of this is a donation. Okay, so please.
Seminole Indian Wars in the 1830s, and all of a sudden we're a country 50 years later. I read this one